Welcome to the Salience Podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
Today on the Salience Podcast, we explore sensemaking and complexity. In a number of our interviews, we have described Boyd's OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, and the Cynefin sensemaking framework. Both OODA and Cynefin place sensemaking as the critical activity. Today's guest is Ellie Snowden. For those familiar with the Cynefin framework and its developer Dave Snowden, well, Ellie is his daughter. Apart from an enormous requirement for personal resilience, being Dave's daughter, Ellie has developed her own deep competency in the field of anthro-complexity and sensemaking. Ellie holds an MA in anthropology of social development and transformation with a specialism in medical anthropology. After working as a qualitative researcher in public policy and employment research, she found herself coming back to her roots and joining the Cynefin Centre in 2016. Ellie leads the Cynefin company's work on health and healthcare, their experience of supporting centre members in their use of SenseMaker and surrounding methods. Some of her projects include identifying drivers of child and early forced marriage with the Women's Refugee Commission in the Philippines and Zimbabwe, and an oral history of nurses' experiences during COVID-19 at the Royal College of Nursing. The work at Cynefin encompasses a broad range of sectors across the commercial and non-commercial divide. Their future work is oriented towards thinking about definitions of organisations and how they are shifting. And keeping things embodied, Ellie is also a trained massage therapist and yoga teacher. Welcome, Ellie.
Hello, thank you so much, Ian, for having me. It's nice to be here.
Well, before we get to sensemaking, I teased earlier about you having to be resilient growing up as Dave's daughter. More seriously, he was clearly an inspiration for you to follow in the family tradition. You know, what childhood experiences predisposed you to this, to Cynefin and what I would call pracademia, that balance between practical and academia? What was childhood like?
Such a big opening question. Where do I begin? Well, childhood for me, I have lots of memories of castles and car journeys, I think. And this is the Welsh side of the family. I'm half Welsh, the better half, as they would probably say. We spent a lot of time visiting castles. And the car journeys there and back were often just as good as the castle itself because there was lots of storytelling. My dad just has this wonderful capacity to read a book and then know it forever, which I struggle with myself. And I love our house was littered with books when we were children, lots of history books. And he kind of has a real keen exploration or desire to explore why things are the way they are in the here and now through lots of different perspectives. So he would bring this in to our conversations in lots of different ways. And there would always be a challenge of assumptions. Now, anyone who knows him knows that he loves an argument. What you might not know, and my mother, bless her, did not know this for a long time, is that if he argues with you, it's a sign of respect and he wants to understand your opinion more. And that's something I think that has really kind of stuck with me as an adult and probably led to a desire in me to study anthropology, which is always about challenging assumptions and bringing in different perspectives through which to understand the world and all its lenses, right? So we would have lots of raging arguments about things in cars. And then, you know, on one such car journey, I think I might have been doing my A-levels, which in the UK is the kind of step before you go off to university and you start closing things down and making decisions for yourself. And it's all a little bit open and scary. And I was kind of having a conversation around, well, what should I do? I love all of these things. I love history. I love English. I love sociology. I love philosophy. I don't want to limit it to one thing. And he said, well, why don't you try anthropology? And yeah, it was a fantastic subject to study. It's probably one of the broadest subjects that you can study. And it's very well known for problematizing the problem rather than having any solution, which kind of suits me. Typically, as anthropologists, we hate to own the meaning of anything, so it's nice and open. Yeah, but I think my dad, he's always been a real source of inspiration for me and a kind of encyclopedia of knowledge, if you like, and a good person to have an argument with. And I probably argue with him quite a lot, especially when I was at uni.
I agree. I think I saw a podcast recently and somebody was talking about people that are militantly combative are too much and people that avoid arguments are too little. And there's a real sweet spot in the middle for that ability to hold a really good, robust argument. And I think one of the things I particularly like about your dad is he does know how to play the argument and the subject matter rather than the person. So he does focus on that intellectual tussle about what is it we're arguing about.
100%. But it's very interesting, isn't it? Because he has a huge background and education around debating, where you are in that step back, and that's a kind of frame through which a conversation is happening. But that's not always what comes through. And I think often, especially in an online space, where the words that we put out there, and Naomi Klein writes beautifully about this in her book Doppelgangers, they become a part of our identity. So that how do we disentangle them from that? And then that's when all sorts of things come through, and, you know, the argument or lack of defense can be taken personally, and yeah, interesting space. I think it's increasingly important to have and feel safe in conversations where we can disagree with one another about things, because it's such a beautiful way to learn. And obviously that can go too far, but yeah.
Yeah. I think the thing I particularly dislike about arguing with your father is that near-eidetic memory for everything he's read, and where he'll go from where you're talking about to the to Catholicism in 1650, back to medieval times, and then forward again. It feels like that's a bit of an unfair advantage, but anyway.
It's a hard agree with that one, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, moving more towards the Cynefin company, I'm really, really interested in healthcare at the moment and healthcare systems. Tell me what motivates you to focus your efforts there. What is it about healthcare that you find fascinating?
Well, I mean, talking of history, because it's a long time ago now, it probably goes back to university for me. So, as you mentioned in the intro, I studied anthropology of development and change. And I kind of ended up specializing in medical anthropology because I realized that everything that I was really inspired by that I was reading during that time was very much focused around health, and in particular women's health as well. I think the health space is absolutely fascinating for me because it's sort of everything. You know, what do we even mean by health? Where does it start? Where does it begin? What are our definitions here? And medical anthropology for me as a subject was it was a really kind of invigorating one, because it wasn't just us anthropologists coming in and studying people in some kind of weird neo-colonial way, such as the old anthropologists used to do. We were coming together with med students. And it was just this wonderful kind of anthropology in action where lots of different perspectives were coming into the room. So I think since then I've had a really keen interest in health and healthcare, because it's such a complex system. And it really entangles some interesting kind of dichotomies of our time, if you like, between kind of self and other, or responsibility and where that lies. And I'm sure we'll kind of come in to talk about that in the future. But importantly, it brings together lots of different bodies of expertise. And quite often, of course, when we have the more kind of complex health conditions, you go to multiple experts and they might disagree with things, but that's a part of the process of making sense of your kind of health or illness journey. So I think I find the kind of multidisciplinary takes on health very fascinating, particularly now when we're looking at preventative health, the role of trauma, for example, in the rise of non-communicable diseases, intersections between environmental health, planetary health, biodiversity, and human health. You know, there's this real kind of coming together and a widening of the exploration between the natural sciences and the social sciences, which is kind of very much where at Cynefin our work is based as well. And this kind of comes from my dad, Dave's background in philosophy and physics, which is an interesting one too. And I think health as well, for me, it's, as an anthropologist, we're very concerned with power and power dynamics and how things often get replicated in interesting ways. And health is kind of no stranger to that. You know, there's lots of issues around kind of assumptions of bodies that have come into this that have detrimental effects for women, for example, and reproductive health being a kind of key one. And often kind of voices and experiences of maybe more marginalized groups are ignored, or they're not brought through in different ways. So I think it's a very, very interesting space through which to explore lots of things that relate to society. And of course, health itself is just a very politicized space as well. In the way that we see it now, we have this kind of optimization or self-optimization or will to health. That we're all supposed to be the most productive, healthy humans that we can be. And whilst there's lots of good in that, there's lots of other juicy things to untangle.
You've touched on a number of really important points there. You led in by talking about the enormity of health and healthcare as a topic, the importance of women's health, and I'd like to give a shout out here to Women's Health Education Network, one of our partners. And then you talked about complex systems and the entanglement between self and other, and this idea of responsibility. And that's I've literally just posted something today on just culture, and the importance of having the word "and," because in just culture, it's very much about the relationship between individuals and the system, and viewing accountability in context of what's going on. So it's not about just blame the system or just blame the person. It needs to be contextual, right? And then you talk about power dynamics, preventative health, and you said something I really want to pick up on, which was about, you said anthropology in action. Can you tell us more about some of the practical things that the process that you've used and the practical outcome that you've seen? So anthropology and sense making in action, that's what I'm really excited about here.
Anthropology in action, yeah. So, I mean, what is anthropology is probably a good place to start with that, because it's the study of humans and what it means to be human. And a big part of anthropology is looking at that through different contexts and through the lens of some of our maybe more background, taken for granted assumptions about what it means to be in the world, to live in the world with one another, and how that shifts across time and space. So, anthropologists are very interested in this idea of worldviews and of culture. And a big part of anthropology is also looking at story and how story shapes us. So there's a really lovely definition of worldview that I often kind of bring into conversations or into my work, which is from Douglas Hind and his book At Work in the Ruins. And he said, worldviews are background maps and stories that shape our perception of the world and our sense of what is possible, while mostly passing for just how things are. Which is so good. And someone just has a really punchy definition of something that makes you pause, because worldviews are quite hard to articulate because they are so background and so taken for granted, and yet they play a huge, huge, huge role in things. And our kind of processes or techniques or tools at Cynefin are very much designed with the idea to kind of bring some of this out in different spaces in different ways. So we work a lot with narrative as a means of revealing some of the things in our contexts that are shaping our experiences and our realities in different ways. And these might be things that are very personal to us, that relate to behaviors, to our kind of social worlds, but they also can be very material or kind of technological. And this is where the idea of sense-making comes in. So there's lots and lots and lots of different ways of defining sense-making, and I think there's about 5 big schools. Obviously, Carl Weick is a really, really big one on sense-making, and he does lots of work in the kind of organizational world, so organizational sense-making, which of course we do and touch on too, kind of psychological lenses. And then you've got Brenda Dervin. He looks a lot around communication and kind of human-machine relationships. So there's this real idea that sense-making isn't just a human endeavor. It's like, how do we make sense of the world in order to act in it? It's an embodied thing. And, depending on who you work with and the scales at which you work, that might mean different things as well. So if we're looking kind of one-on-one, the relationship between our kind of somatic sense-making and story might be to maybe challenge that story or bring new stories to light. Whereas the way that we work with story, well, there's many ways that we work with story, but it's using story as a kind of means and a method to reveal some of these things that are operating, some of the things that are underneath the table or underneath the surface. And we do this Because obviously when we think about story, you kind of think about the danger of a single story. And this is where the anthropology, I think, comes in. And we do this through this idea of multi-perspective narrative. Because we all have our kind of habitual ways of thinking and doing, our kind of biases of perception that relate to our ideas around our own sense of agency and action, as well as, in a kind of social ecology, how they relate to those of others. And by bringing a multi-perspective narrative into our work, which sounds a little bit woolly right now, so I'm happy to go into that a little bit more if it would be helpful. It's this idea of kind of bringing lots of people's descriptions of reality together to get a very kind of rich map of maybe kind of contrasting or paradoxical views, nonetheless, that are coming together in some interesting ways. So we explore this via a research tool, but also kind of workshop facilitation. So we might be working story in smaller groups, story to kind of build into strategy. And a lot of it is around this kind of idea of using sense-making to support some of the ideas around knowledge sufficiency in complex systems. Because, of course, one of the characteristics of complex systems is that we often don't even know the questions we need to ask because there's so much that we don't know. So we kind of bring these ideas in to explore the intractable issues in maybe slightly more, not small or simple, but ways that feel more personal to you and your kind of experience within different contexts. So I've gone on a little bit there, so I'll pause because I'm sure there's probably some needs for definitions and follow-up questions that are emerging.
I think it's a terrific explanation of the relationship between anthropology, sense-making, narrative, and then how you use those in a qualitative and a quantitative way. So you've got workshops. I know that we use patterns. They're both quantified. We look at. I like the way you said this. A rich map with different views, sometimes intentional or in contrast. What I'd like to do is I'd like you to think of an example where you've run this with an organization, and you've got. I'm going to be archetypal here in a fairly cruel way. You got the chief financial officer going, "We've just spent a bucket load of money on this. What for? What difference did it make in the health system?" So I'm the CFO. I've got my CFO hat on. I'm desperate to cut money because there's never enough money in healthcare. I want to chop this stuff out because it's all a bunch of stories. What difference does it make, and how have you seen it make a tangible difference on the ground?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question. And of course, if you're at that kind of level of seniority, especially in the healthcare system, you're so far up the hierarchy that the idea of knowledge sufficiency is even more important. Now, a key kind of part of our work with narrative is this idea of disintermediated narrative. So it's sharing stories word for word with people so that, it's not that messages are being passed up the hierarchy through different roles and getting diluted and seen through different lenses on the way, but you're reading that experience word for word. So, an example, when we worked with the Royal College of Nursing, and we did a piece during the pandemic that was specifically focused on well-being. And of course, this is like a rapidly changing environment, as we all know, placing a huge amount of strain on healthcare workers. And this piece we ran for about 2 years. It was a longitudinal piece where we asked nurses to share a story from their last week. And the ask was very broad. It was simply share a story about something that's happened that matters to you and needs to be heard. So we're not kind of limiting what it's possible for them to say there. But there are a few kind of different outcomes for this. First of all, there's something special in sharing a story without being kind of pushed into a certain frame of a response in a qualitative way. And secondly, the lead in the organization that we were working with, she kind of shared that she was starting to take these stories directly to the board. And she said, "I'm no longer speaking on behalf of the nurses when I come into these spaces. The nurses are in the room with me, even if it's not physically." So I think there's the disintermediated element. There's also, there's another project that I worked on in healthcare where we were looking at burnout. Now, this was kind of post-pandemic. Burnout and I think kind of bullying. And this kind of maybe comes into some of the conversations we were having before we hit on the record button. around your kind of spectrum of risk appetite with the bad guys and the good guys, which maybe you can kind of bring in, because I found that so interesting. But we were kind of looking at what some kind of maybe more cultural or interpersonal factors might be that are contributing to the space of burnout. Like, where does the burnout lie? And this is where I think some of the interesting things around individual versus system come in, or that like false binary or the victim perpetrator narrative that underpins a lot of things that are going on in the world today and doesn't necessarily give agency to anyone in important ways. But, we're looking at kind of burnout, and this was a surgical ward, multidisciplinary team. Been lots of kind of top-down changes, as is tradition in healthcare, that people were kind of battling. And it was a really, really, really slow process of asking people to share stories, because, of course, you use the word story in a healthcare system as well, and that has its own connotations, right? It seems a little bit soft and fluffy, and maybe it's not going to land. But interestingly, when we put this kind of tool out for a story collection, we started to get lots of narratives through, particularly from junior members of the team. People who don't, and that can be very confronting. Or you can create a space where those new outsider perspectives come in and maybe challenge some of the things that aren't working anymore and might need shifting, right? That's this kind of idea of bringing in insider and outsider perspectives of anthropology. Anyway, I'm side questing, as I often do. But we got lots of stories through from these junior doctors with stories of how they felt very uncomfortable with the way that surgeons were speaking to them. So they were kind of, the word bullying wasn't mentioned, but it was there in a kind of implicit sense. It comes back maybe to this kind of weak signals, red flag element that you bring through in your work. I'd love to hear more on. And we started to see this kind of pattern building up. And there was this real archetype of an angry, aggressive surgeon emerging through these stories that were being told. Now, the kind of immediate response there from the client was, this is not okay. We need to go in and do some behavioural interventions with these surgeons. We need to start every meeting with a treaty around how we do and do not speak with one another. And it was just like a really well-meaning but very kind of healthcare paternalistic response to something that just had much, much, much deeper roots, at least from how we, with our biases, were seeing things anyway. So we encouraged them to keep the story collection open for a little bit longer, and just to kind of maybe share it with a few different roles and perspectives. And so eventually they built up enough trust that some of the surgeons shared their stories as well. And this is where things got really interesting, because there are a couple of stories coming through from surgeons that are actually really quite vulnerable. And there was one in particular that shared how the way the daily list, so when all the roles come together to talk about what they're doing throughout the day, had changed, had meant that this surgeon now had far less one-on-one contact time with their patients. So this was contributing to him feeling really out of control, because he didn't have that kind of embodied interaction and way of communicating with the patients that enabled him, in his perspective, to do his job in a really good way and feel good about it. He therefore was increasingly reliant on the junior members of the team to come to him with information, and this wasn't happening anymore, and he just didn't know what to do. So like all the sides in this story around burnout and stress, no one was feeling empowered. The way that the day was organized was having a detrimental effect on everyone, and it just shifted the conversation from blame to, okay, let's humanize this. Everyone's having a bad time. What can we do about it? And then, from there came some quite small shifts that they did. They didn't require a big kind of structural or top-down change. And quite often kind of in our space, when we're thinking about what happens next, we're thinking about that spectrum. What's one small thing that you might do differently this week based on these stories that you've seen? So it's kind of using narrative as a way to challenge your story, but also to bring your story in, because that's a part of it too. So we often use the kind of metaphor of a tapestry, because at the front of the tapestry, you've got this beautiful representation that we want to kind of put out into the world. But underneath it, you've got all these threads that are really, really messy. They're all part of it as well. So we're kind of about amplifying those small stories, seeing what patterns emerge, and working from the stories themselves to see where we might want to go.
And on that example, I mean, this is a classic example across healthcare, isn't it? The doctors, the nurses, the surgeons, that conflict that's got a professional boundary there. Did you get a resolution? Did they work out how to communicate with each other, get the lists organized, change the stress? Did you find that the narrative shifted?
We did see a few little shifts, and this is also an ongoing piece of work because they're interested in looking at culture change. And what I really love about this client is they're not nouning culture. Culture is something that we're aware is moving. It shifts over time, and it shifts in the way that we reveal it come through in the stories. So they've made a huge amount of changes to the way that they bring people together now throughout the day. Because obviously, there's certain changes that can't be made within healthcare systems because they're there for everyone's safety and for risk reduction. But this organisation, they recognised that there was a huge value in maybe bringing together some voices in ways that weren't dependent on hierarchical forms of communication. So, these junior doctors and the surgeons, there's certain protocols around the way interactions happen that could maybe be disrupted. So in complexity, quite a lot of the time, we talk about the relationship between the informal networks and the formal networks in your organizations. So what this trust did was they organized some tea trolley events where they, every week, did a little collation of stories. And they did this on a newsletter as well. And it was a way of kind of bringing together these different perspectives and inviting everyone into reading the stories themselves. And if you were there at the moment where tea was being served, quite often there were lots of different roles coming together randomly in that space, then the invitation was to have a conversation about it and share what was showing up. So really small little things, but over time we're seeing lots of kind of beneficial outcomes in terms of the way people are working with one another. And we're now doing a piece with them that looks at this kind of tripartite relationship between theatre productivity, safety, but also well-being. And these three are intimately related.
There's so much there. I love the tea trolley as a means of the micro interactions, but from an evidence base that stimulates that conversation. And I think that, if you can imagine an entire health system where everybody's talking around tea trolleys, water coolers, cafes, they're having coffee with each other, culture will just shift enormously into, as you say, away from binaries. As soon as you're having those conversations, they're no longer binaries. I love the metaphor of the spider and the fly, and that metaphor linking to systems and the poor innocents who might come in bemused by this, highly complicated system, and using that word quite precisely.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And the language, you say, narrative, it's almost like how do you, I don't know if sell it's the right word, but socialize this idea that narratives are what we're looking for. And I recently had an experience with, I'm interested in personal resilience and organizational resilience and the relationships between them. But it's got such a negative connotation for so many people in healthcare where it's been pushed upon them where they think, I've been told I just need more resilience. But again, it's a binary. It's not connected to the system. And so I've recently changed the way that I do insights, and we've come up with something, and it's taken a very mature health organization to do this, where we're calling it a healthcare system co-design. So instead of talking about organizational resilience and personal resilience, we're talking about co-design. And by that, the invitation from the top is we want to change, we want to innovate, but it's a co-design process with the whole organization right down to the front line of the business within boundaries. Here's the boundary conditions, here's the guiding principles, here's our constraints. And now let's co-design this together so everybody owns where we're going. So it's a very different frame, and I'm super curious to see how the engagement rates compare, because I suspect they'll be a lot higher.
Oh, I'd love to hear more about this. I think you're right. I think resilience is a highly loaded term. And I think it's, for me, that when you were sharing that, the thought that came to mind is, a person living with anxiety, right? Which we all have from time to time. Some of us a little bit more chronic than others. When someone tells you just to relax. And it's not that simple. And I think personal resilience is a huge, huge thing, but it doesn't happen out of context, right? It's not something that's located just in here. And I think if you're a person who is maybe struggling, hearing that you need to become more resilient, whilst it's not untrue, can feel so far away that you feel like you failed in some way. And then that in turn has implications for how you show up and how you put yourself out there. And, I think it's a really, really fascinating concept. And I love that you are bringing it in and seeing it as a kind of emergent property of the system, which is individual and wider, without necessarily mentioning it explicitly. Because it's there. It's one of those underpinning things, isn't it, that shifts and changes. And
Well, that's an interesting, for me, there's an interesting binary and there's an analog between it. And there's a lot of people talking on social media that well-being, resilience, behaviors, these are emergent properties of the system. And then there's a whole bunch of other binary dichotomy that says it's all about the individuals and behaviors and leadership and whatever. And I very much take a middle view that people are an intrinsic entangled part of the system. Our behaviors can change the system. And what is the system? Like, who owns the system? Well, it's owned by people. It's shaped by people. So I don't think you can talk about behavior and culture without individuals and systems. And in fact, for me, the unit I like to focus on, which I think has got the most leverage, I call it leverage, is teams. I think if we can work at it's quite a small granular process of team dynamics. Teams are, maybe 10 people at the most. If we can get teams to shift and then coalesce, then I think that for me is the leverage point. I go off topic here, but I want to ask you that question about, imagine there's this, emergent properties at one end, individuals at the other. Where are you in the spectrum of what do you think, if you were going to look for leverage, where do you go? Where do you put your leverage? I go at individuals at the team level. Where do you go?
it's such a juicy question, and I love it. And I don't know if I would place emergent properties at one end of a spectrum. See, the spectrum that I'm envisioning is kind of materialism on the one hand and social constructionism on the other, or individual collective. And I think they're like these kind of, that for me doesn't feel right. I think the idea of emergent properties for me is that, individuals are firmly within this broader set of relations, but we're looking at the relationships, like that's our unit. Because, you have a behavior that comes from a set of experiences that then goes out and has an effect in different ways. And there's kind of relative capacities that we all have to affect and be affected by our environments, to use a kind of Deleuzian, Guattarian term. And I think this is really, really interesting in health. And I know that, you do work with trauma, for example. Okay, so there's a huge correlation between a history of trauma and autoimmune conditions, especially in women, right? So where does the responsibility for this in a preventative sense lie? And this is where all the really really stuff in health for me lies, around kind of multi-system support and the kind of Nora Bateson type thing around trans-contextualism. But then at the same time, you have that lovely cultural idiom, hurt people hurt people. So you do need to take responsibility for your actions and behaviours and the way that you show up as well. And I think, there can be a tendency, maybe especially in online worlds, to fall into the either or camp here. And again, maybe it comes back to that victim-perpetrator dichotomy that kind of underlines both responses, no matter which side you're coming from. But I think, for me, the kind of idea of things being a distributed property of a system takes us into that space of both and or in betweens, because it's about the relationships. And I think there was just a really lovely example that I saw that really elucidated what that phrase even means, because it can feel a little bit woolly, in Emergence magazine. And they had this gorgeous image of a seagull flying with this question, where is flight, right? Because is the flight something that belongs to the bird? Can we reduce it to the properties of its wing? Well, kind of yes, and the bird's flight is also dependent on all of the other kind of constraints, the weather, the air currents that it's floating around, and I think that's just a really lovely way of showing this idea of distributed agency, where it takes into account all of this. if you'll permit me to bring in an example from a piece of work we did as well that you mentioned in the intro, because I think it's really interesting. So we were doing a piece in kind of international development world around drivers of child and early forced marriage. So this was a kind of narrative collection piece, an overall project that needed to be very girl-led. And there were some kind of strong research questions around like what levels of agency do young women have in particular communities, in particular countries across the world. And I can share with you a publication of this afterwards. But the idea was just to collect stories from young women. And we kind of challenged this and actually did a story collection with young women, but also young men, members of the community, religious faith leaders, parents. And we got this really, at times quite harrowing, but really rich and interesting picture of how the agency of young women was perceived by themselves, but also by others. And those kind of interesting social entanglements that together were forming this picture of what is and isn't possible.
Did you identify in that study an adjacent possible?
So there were lots of stories that are emerging around the kind of interactions and levels of trust that parents were or were not showing to children. And actually, we did some participatory workshops with this. And because this was a strong pattern that was coming through as having the potential to design intervention around. So we ended up getting involved with some family therapy organizations who came in and did some work specifically looking at that idea of building trust and sharing experiences between the generations as a way of kind of learning as well. But the idea of the adjacent possible in complexity, do you want to talk a little bit more about how you see that and how it comes through in your work? Because I'm intrigued by your intro questions on this.
Well, in a very simple way, I talked about this health agency's got a very mature approach, and we're talking about this co-design process. The philosophy there is, what can you do, starting where you are, with what you have, what can you do next? And that's very much about, well, there's no point me asking for a business case for $10 million, right? Well, there might be, but it's going to take an awful lot of work to get $10 million, right? But within my own locus of influence or potentially control, what is it that I can do to improve? Or what could we do differently? What can we do within our own sense of agency? And that often implies that there's a degree of adjacency and a degree of possibility. An example might be, is there somebody else somewhere else that's doing something that we could try? That's a great way of defining the possibility. And when you talked about the different demographics in the young girls situation, I just wondered if in that challenge, if there was an adjacency where you thought, we could shift the system here as a first step towards perhaps where we might want to go. I just wondered if there's a really clear, that's an adjacent possible that emerged and that's where we're going and how we're going to get there.
Yeah. I think for me, the way that tends to come through in our work by virtue of the fact that we're bringing different narratives together is looking at the kind of so the kind of like social relational side of that. So maybe we have like wildly differing or conflicting views on things, and we see this in the patterns, and then we see that there's this tiny little space between two perspectives that are wildly different, where there's some similarities that lie. So it's a way, in the way that we work, of kind of shifting how we're maybe aggregating things. So, okay, we've got demographics, and maybe we've got left wing, right wing, I can't get my words out today because it's 6 a.m. here, left wing, right wing, but maybe there's some underlying attitudinal factors that actually have the capacity to connect people and take us beyond these schisms. Maybe that's where we should be putting our hope. I mean, some of this is a bit of a politics of hope, if you like. We have adjacent possible. You also got the Kafka idea or the Deleuzean idea of a line of flight. Is there something that we can look at here that maybe shifts the patterns that are getting more heavy set, more ingrained, that are ossifying in ways that aren't helpful? But then in our kind of approach to that, I think there's probably our own assumptions and biases around human connectivity as well, and that's not always possible. But one of the kind of key principles of taking action in complexity, as you know, is this idea of, what are the dispositions in the present moment? This idea of the thick present, like what is likely to happen and how can we use that to think about what happens next, rather than we want a happy clappy ending where life is brilliant and there's no strife at all in the world. Let's pull towards that, which whilst it can be mobilizing, all sorts of stuff happens in the in-between.
Just reflecting on a number of things you've said here, it's interesting. The penny dropped for me on something I've been doing, but I hadn't. It was an intuitive move, and it's to do with that. When I said the level in an organization, I think, or the unit that I think I'm getting the most impact is at the level of teams, particularly when they coalesce. And part of the reason for that was I have identified that when managers and supervisors are able to have meaningful supervisions and conversations and manage in a safe way so people don't feel threatened, you get team cohesion, and we get the telemetry of risk going up the organization. So risks, red flags from weak signals, people going, uh-oh, I've got an uneasy feeling about this. We can have a conversation about it. Some go by the wayside. Okay, that's not significant. Some go, uh-oh, yep, we really need to worry about that. And in fact, my boss needs to worry about that. And so does all the way up to the board, right? But what I think you said was it's all about, emergent properties are all about relationships. And actually, that's the reason that the team unit is so effective. It's less about the telemetry of risk. It's more about the team unit is where most of the relational activities occur. If any single person, if you look at the mapping, the social network mapping or organizational mapping, I think it's at the level of team with the most frequent relational interactions. So I suspect that's the reason why I'm looking to combine at that level. And I hadn't worked that out until you said it. I went, I wonder if that's intuitively how come I'm doing it. So you've explained it for me.
It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because and this is, my dad talks a lot about Dunbar's number. Heard of this? I remember him telling me this on another car journey when we were younger, lots of car journeys. But it's this idea that we've evolved into have trust in groups of around 5 or 6. And that's safe in our nervous systems, it's safe in our biology as much as it's safe in our social spaces. So I think, when you're operating at the level of a team, there's that proximity to one another. And obviously remote working puts a spanner in the works sometimes, but you're probably working on things together, you're taking action together. So you have that sense of, and a lot of the time trust comes down to visibility and transparency, but it's just so much more than that, right? Because I'm trusting you to get on and do this. So I think there's the relationships within the team that are at this level of me and you and us. But then there's also how we think about kind of maybe bigger groups of actors. So quite often in our work, so we do complex facilitation. So we'll bring in this idea that you're sharing around teams being this important size of group into the way that we group the room. So we might kind of group people based on their roles so that when they're having small group discussions, they can talk on their own language and their kind of codified ways without having to explain things, and everyone feels heard. Then it's about kind of entangling roles in different combinations so that we can do that interesting, I use the word tessellate, but I don't know if I'm misusing it, that kind of tessellation of different experiences in slightly different ways. Because you can have, within an organization, you have an individual, you have a team, you have an identity, you have a role, you have a structure. And those are all different things that are coming together with different types of relationships between one another and within themselves. So I think when you put relationships as the unit, okay, you don't want to reify the relationships and remove yourself from looking at the whole or looking at the individuals as well. But it just gives you some interesting ways of thinking about who's speaking with who, and if you might want to create some shifts in the types of communication or sharing that might be possible based on that.
Yeah. You've definitely had a rarefied upbringing, talking about Dunbar's number in the car as a kid. the
I promise you there
conversation.
were lots of stories as well. There were stories. They were
The stories I have with my kids are about the characters in Minecraft and the all the ski runs that my 8-year-old wants to do, and how come it's closed, and will we get there next season? But I'll move on. I am actually going to introduce Dunbar's number to him in tomorrow's car journey to school and see what response I get. I'll report back. Uh, just on culture. I mean, this is so much of this is about culture, and the narratives and how that can articulate and even define and and even change culture through narrative and metaphor. Just thinking about what's important to you for a minute. This is a really broad question. What in the aspects of culture, what do you encourage more of or less of?
I mean, it really depends on what's there. I think I can tell you my pet peeve around people who think about culture when people say, we have a culture of X, we would like a culture of Y. Because that just doesn't make any sense to me. We can say that we're noticing patterns around a certain thing, but that doesn't define the whole culture. That's like one element of it. And how much can we actually define and change culture like we're some kind of a master pulling puppet strings, right? To do culture, when you're living and breathing culture, we wouldn't exist without culture. And I think for me, it's the small things and kind of noticing how they're shifting over time and doing our best to reveal those. And this is where the story element comes in. So I have questions around how much you can change culture, because it may be that you just view things from the benefit of hindsight and see how things have shifted. But I think it's also a feeling that we maybe have, and this is where some of the kind of hidden assumption sides of defining culture come in. Yeah, sorry, I'm blubbering around a little bit on that one, Ian.
No, I think you've identified that, that I like you said, this is not something amenable to a puppet master. I have I think it's an adjacent view. It's not a puppet master, and it's not everything's up in the air and emergent anyway. I think, and I don't know if this is the best term. It's probably not, but I don't have a better one, and I invite you to critique it. Which is, I think there's a degree of shaping or designing, or perhaps more in the realm of a garden, if you like that metaphor, where we can use constraints, we can introduce ways of being, we can introduce habits and rituals, and they will shift culture in, and I'm not going to say predictable ways in the sense of cause and effect predict, but we can anticipate that certain patterns are likely to emerge within certain constraints. If you do things and you repeat them a number of times, you go, this seems to be working and getting more like Y and less like X. An example might be, let's take X is everybody hates each other. Trust is very, very low. Subjectively, it's 2 out of 10, and everyone hates each other. And then Y would be happy clappy land. 10 out of 10, everyone's kind of friendly. 8 out of 10 might be, well, there's some constructive conflict. These are the kind of analogs, right? So let's say we introduce one thing, which is that it could be a heuristic. Everybody makes an agreement that they will not complain to the manager without at least raising the concern with their teammate. I mean, I'm making one up, but sometimes this is emerged, right? When you ask the question for this team. And when that occurs, you would usually see a shift in culture more towards Y. There might be some spin-offs and occasionally it won't work, but more or less certain things seem to produce more like Y and less like X. So I don't think I'm kind of spend a lot of time in the middle.
Yeah. But this is a really, really interesting one, because again, it's, there's different scales through which we can understand culture. Because when we're looking at an organization, the garden metaphor really works, because an organization is small and you've come together with a specific purpose. But maybe you're looking at your community where you live or the country in which you grew up. Cultural factors there are much, much, much bigger. but also maybe there's been lots of sociology and anthropology, and we understand those patterns because they've been kind of studied in terms of how they show up and how they might be shifting. So I think, within organizations, the idea of cultivation becomes more probable or more possible because you've got a smaller unit. Not always, because sometimes you've got huge organizations. I used to work in American Express for my sins in the call center when I was doing my master's, and they would always talk about culture, but also they put a huge amount of effort into the way communication was done. And I thought that was a really beautiful way, because culture is communication, really. It's about creating a context where mutual learning can take place, to bring in the Bateson kind of idea. So yeah, and I think the idea of introducing a ritual and a habit makes a lot of sense to me in terms of thinking about cultural change, because you're looking at that relationship between the individual and their environment. And rituals have this wonderful capacity to take us from one space to another, and the anthropological term is betwixt and between, and all the kind of juicy stuff that happens in the middle. But I think we want to create a culture of why. Here's the end goal. This is perhaps where the idea of obliquity comes in complexity, where we kind of look at the edges and we think about things where we can nudge things that aren't so direct that we're predisposing a criteria for success or an outcome on it, and therefore putting our blinkers on to anything else that happens in the in-between. Because of the unpredictability, because of the unknowns in complex spaces. So there's this idea around safe to fail, or quite often I use the term safe to try in healthcare because fail has its own connotations, experiment, where to incite change maybe at the cultural level, you introduce a few little ideas, a few little rituals to transform things, a few different ways of shifting the way that we communicate or our kind of habits. And then you use them themselves to gain a little bit more knowledge around what's going on and how things land. And it may be that a bigger intervention comes from there. But yeah, this is where we could get into the terrain of all the lovely theories of change out there. So I'll pause. But I do love that metaphor of the garden, because you've got the machine, you've got the garden, you've got the absolute wilderness.
Yeah, I love that term you use, cultivation. I think that's got some really, I think that's the better metaphor than shape or design, actually. We can cultivate, we can put in boundaries, constraints. And I think you nailed it there, where you were talking about, well, cultures, I mean, you didn't use the word fractal, but it's essentially, it goes from a team all the way through to the whole of the planet. And then somewhere in there's the organization. And there are relationships or patterns that might be at different scales. I don't want to digress too much into change management right now, because I think we could definitely go down that rabbit hole for another hour. And I want to summarize a few things I've taken. I love obliquity and working at the edges. That's for another time. Going back up, I think that there's something important about relationships and conversations. And you mentioned about the tea trolley. And I think that's something I'm going to take away, which is thinking about how I can foster those conversations when we're giving the insights back to organizations. So that's really important. And then there are a couple of other things, particularly around the importance of narrative and rich maps, the disintermediation, and really connecting into my archetypal CFO with the front line of the business, and then, trying to bring that voice into the boardroom as if they're there. And I do think that's so important. And then you really emphasize the importance of bringing together very disparate voices and almost letting that percolate for a moment. There's a patience in your work. You talk about longitudinal studies, sharing stories over years, and I think that's really nice. And we came in on this, about this importance of stories. And I'm just wondering, we've gone from your early days, the car rides, Dunbar's number, and the craziness of those conversations as a kid, given those early days, what are your future aspirations, either in work or elsewhere in your life? Where do you see a direction heading?
Well, I love this question because it's a very open one for me at the moment. I'm actually applying for PhDs to look kind of more explicitly about the use and role of narrative in healthcare, with a particular interest in kind of more complex non-communicable disease. Because again, there's lots of different disciplines coming into this. There's a real drive for a preventative approach because this is increasing. And I'm very, very interested in stress. And again, this lovely phrase, stress is a distributed property of the system, and what that might mean and how we can explore that in different ways. And I think with that, at Cynefin, we do a lot of work on what we call anthro-complexity, with the view that, as my dad says, human beings are not ants. We can't necessarily understand human systems and complexity in the same way that we might understand ant systems, although we can see some similarities in a fractal sense. They are different. But I think, this line of inquiry that I'm drawing, it's this kind of interesting relationship between, human or anthro-complexity on the one hand, but also biological complexity, and also with the use of kind of predictive modeling and AI, computational complexity. And they're all kind of different maps for understanding more granular things, but in healthcare, they really come together. And I think that's something I want to explore. I have such an interest in narrative and story because it's kind of everything. It's very biological for us. Tyson Yunkaporta, an Aboriginal scholar, I'm sure that you know, wonderful human being. He talks a huge amount about story being like the best storage capacity that we have, which I've, in a terrible pun, reframed as intergenerational storage, because it's the stories that we share through the generations that kind of travel and shift. They kind of, what's it called? Not the stuff that we necessarily ossify into words, but the stuff that happens through our interactions with one another, where a huge amount of information is shared. And I'm very interested in how how narrative is used in health. And there's obviously a kind of huge discipline around narrative medicine and kind of health humanities that brings this in. But what story means on a kind of somatic level and kind of somatic storytelling, as much as the cognitive stuff that we do here as well. So I've got all sorts of ideas, and unfortunately I'm a little bit of a lifelong learner, and as soon as I come onto one idea, I want to do a course on it and learn more, which is detrimental to my wallet as well as my brain capacity, but here we are.
I love it. Okay, so heading towards further research into narrative, story, stress, healthcare, and really the preventative health space. Let's watch this space. We'll keep in touch. And thanks for joining me today on the Salience Podcast.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.